So what are we doing today? Three, I guess, broad areas. We're going to do an overview of the structure of these new standards because they've changed a bit from how they were previously. We're also going to explore ASQA's practice guides. They've got some really good guidance available that adds a bit of additional commentary to the new standards. And then we're going to dive into some of the details. Not if it was to cover everything in the new standards, it would be probably a one-day session or a half-a-day session, definitely not 1 hour. So I've tried to focus on the important bits and try to strike that balance between enough detail to dive into the important stuff, but also not rehash things that are pretty much the same. So notable or key differences with a particular focus on the things that probably affect trainers and assessors on a regular basis. And most of our community is made up of people who are a trainer and assessor or in that kind of more practice role. I know we often get a lot of questions about, will I get a certificate? So those who do attend the session will get a certificate of attendance. We do, to keep the system fair, we do try and make sure that it's people who can attend for at least 80% of the session will get a certificate of attendance, just to keep it fair. So this one needs to have a bit of a disclaimer. Number one, it's not advice. I really don't want to be held accountable for anyone, implementing something that they've learned here today and then to only have a regulatory action or something and they blame me for it. So this is to be not taken as advice. I might jump down to that third bullet point there and really say, I probably should have had that up front. I'm not a compliance guru. It was the last time somebody called me a compliance guru, the AQTF 2007 was being implemented. And I was doing compliance consulting for RTOs then. That's getting close to 20 years ago. And we're all grappling with a new set of standards in 2007. But these days, I run an RTO, and so I can only really share things from the perspective of what we're doing. I do get to talk to other providers and I do learn a little bit about what others are doing, but really it's just kind of a bit of sharing of experience of what I've learned. Unless I clearly state otherwise, I'm going to be paraphrasing. So thanks, Sally, for your note there about echoing. If anyone else is getting that, please let me know. I'm using a slightly different microphone, so if that's a problem, I can try and switch. Hopefully I'm coming across clearly. Okay, so I will be paraphrasing. So the wording in these standards they're pretty wordy. It's legalese. It's necessarily it's written in a way that it kind of locks in the regulatory requirements. So when I've put the words on the screen in pretty much all circumstances, unless I clearly state otherwise, I'm paraphrasing the words. I'm simplifying. I've really taken great care to not take away the meaning or not dilute the meaning by doing that, but still just distill the essence of what that thing is saying. So the caution on that is if you find something that you want more information on or more clarity on, I strongly recommend going into the standards. I've kept references throughout. So, if it says 2.1a, you can easily go and find it in the standards yourself and look up the exact wording. So I'm just to try and keep it simple because there's already a lot of words on the screen, and as a trainer, I'm very conscious of that kind of stuff. And as I already mentioned, I'm not going to cover everything because we just can't possibly do that. As it stands, I'm a little bit worried that it might be too much for this session, which I have been guilty of doing the last few webinars. So what's the structure of these new standards? So I think the key difference is they've kind of broken down things a little bit more, whereas previously the standards were just kind of like a big document, a big list of everything just kind of all written. And we kind of had a bit of a mix of what they term compliance requirements and what they might call quality requirements. And so what they've done in the new standards is they've tried their best to kind of split out or separate compliance requirements to quality outcomes. And so there's a set of the documents that they literally call them the compliance requirements. And here's an example of one of those written on the screen here. It says, RTOs must notify ASQA of an event that would significantly affect the organisation's ability to comply within 10 business days. So I haven't really covered those today because the compliance requirements of those, they're fairly black and white. So that one written there, you know, it's pretty clear what needs to happen. You've got to go and tell the regulator if something major happens in your RTO, particularly if it affects your ability to comply or deliver a quality service to your students. So they probably don't need anyone to really give you too much commentary on that. I don't think. They're pretty clear cut. And then what I will focus on is the quality outcome standards. So they're the things that they've tried to describe quality or describe outcomes or what sort of things that an RTO should do to demonstrate that they're a good provider. And those things are a little bit more open for interpretation. And I think that is necessary. I think that it's good that it's like that because we have a broad range of training providers out there. We have big colleges, we have TAFE, of course, we have community providers, we have the small mum and dad providers with just 2 or 3 employees. We've got enterprise RTOs that only train their own staff. So I think they've really honoured that idea that we have a very diverse vet sector and a lot of RTOs. And so hopefully the wording allows smaller providers to comply in their own way, as opposed to, maybe the requirements interpreted differently for a larger provider. I don't know. I think that's also going to bring into a question about how the regulatory officers are going to interpret it. That's always been something. And I know that in our networks, we often can whinge and moan about how, ASQA maybe treated someone unfairly and someone else's audit or performance assessment was done or interpreted differently. Performance assessors, the regulator, it's made up of humans. They're only humans. So there's probably going to be some element of that. They're not going to be perfect. But what I do get a sense of from the experiences we've had in our dealings with ASQA is they seem to be really trying to educate themselves and make sure that there is this common understanding between the performance assessors and hopefully a common understanding among RTOs. So it'll be interesting to see how these play out. Maybe we could re-watch this session 12 months from now and see what's really happening. So here's the 3 key components in the new standards. So we have the outcome standards. That's the bit I was just talking about that kind of describe the quality of the qualities or the things that an RTO needs to do to demonstrate that they're providing quality training. And that's what we're going to focus on mostly today. They've got the list of compliance requirements, which are a bit more clear cut. And so you can go and refer to those and they say things like, yeah, you've got to notify ASQA within 10 days or whatever it is. And you've got to put this in your certificates and fit and proper persons and all those kinds of things. That's all pretty easy to understand. And then this is a new one. They've kind of taken out these, back in the previous standards, they had a set of schedules and they kind of listed it as an appendix at the end of the document. Now they've got this kind of separate standalone thing that we only really got to look at fairly recently, and that's the credential policy. And long story short, that just lists the qualifications that trainers and assessors need to have to be able to train and assess, and a few other things like validation. So it's kind of good having them in separate places so we can shift our focus as needed. Now, because we're going to be zooming, we're going to be focusing in on point number 1 there, the outcome standards. So they're further broken down into a structure as well. So let's look at that structure. So they're broken down into what they term, this got a little bit confusing, I found, the terminology where they kind of have it broken down into what they call 4 quality areas, but they also call them parts, like part 1, part 2, part 3 and 4. And they're also attached to 4 outcomes. So you sort of see that terminology mixed and matched throughout, but I would probably term them a quality area. So the 4 quality areas that are a focus in these outcome standards is number 1, the quality area 1 is training and assessment. So that is the way that the training and assessing is happening in the provider. And that's linked to one overall outcome, which they say the quality training and assessment, and again, paraphrasing a bit, quality training and assessment engages vet students and enables them to attain nationally recognised industry relevant competencies. The second quality area is vet student support. So there's this really good, I think it's great, this new emphasis on vet student support as a separate area. And the overall outcome for that is that the vet students are treated fairly and are properly informed, and that they're supported and protected on their journey. The third quality area is vet workforce. So they've got a separate section for the people that are involved in the training and the running of the RTO. So they say that vet students are trained, assessed, and supported by people who are qualified, skilled, I like this one, are committed to professional development, just like you all are, because there's 500 people and probably more trying to get in, sorry to all the others, that are here today because you're committed to professional development. So look at that, you're already on your way to meeting quality area 3. And there's a section on governance, quality area 4, effective governance and a commitment to continuous improvement supports the quality and integrity of vet delivery. I'll do a brief thing on governance, but not too much. Most of what we need to talk about today is in quality areas 1 and 2, because that impacts us the most as trainers and assessors. We'll talk briefly about quality area 3, but it's actually, if anything, it's probably been a bit of a relaxing of the requirements than anything else. And I think, just broadly speaking, when I think about all these changes, I'm not really seeing anything that's particularly onerous on providers as a whole. There's nothing in here that kind of feels grossly unfair or, you know, is such a dramatic change that it would be unfair to expect providers to meet those requirements. I feel as someone who's in this with all of you, trying, you know, to run an RTO and to just do what you're doing, make sure myself and all of our team are complying with these requirements. When I look at these outcomes, I kind of feel like, okay, you know, we could probably lift our game in a few areas, but we're talking little tweaks here and there, you know, maybe a bit more of a policy here and there, maybe a bit more professional development in a few areas like the student support, if we can get better at that. But I'm not feeling like it doesn't feel like, gee, that's unfair. It feels like, yeah, that's fair enough. We probably should be doing that as training providers. And, you know, maybe if we're not, we need to be questioning whether we're in the right game. So I'm pretty happy with it. There's a few things that are a little bit challenging. One is the retention requirement. I haven't mentioned this today, but the retention requirements. So RTOs need to keep evidence of student completed work. It used to be 6 months and now it's 2 years. And well, for anyone who's under like a funding arrangement with the government, will probably already have a requirement like that anyway. But it just means we have to keep evidence of our students' assignments a bit longer. And the only thing that's got me thinking on that is if you subscribe to a software provider, like a learning management system that you use to you know, for students to submit their work, you might need to think about, you know, if you need to change providers, if you've got a, you know, maybe if they stop offering the product for whatever reason, or that you decide they're no longer serving your needs and you want to switch to a new learning management system, that you know, 6 months, keeping the evidence there for 6 months was one thing, but keeping it there for 2 years is you know, is a big ask. So you might have to think about, well, how do we sunset? How do we roll out the new system but keep the old? There might be some costs in that, or how do you export the data? So that's a question for the tech gurus to answer, but something that we might need to consider if you're in a leadership role. Let's get into it. I'm digressing and we don't have time for that. So now the structure of the outcome standards is they have, each bit is kind of broken into two sections where they have the outcome standard, and I think that's the what. So each one starts with a broad statement that kind of sets the benchmark. It describes what the RTO needs to do to achieve, like a high-level goal or a principle that defines this really high-level key aspect. This is what we're aiming for. And an example of that is, and this is word for word, reasonable adjustments are made to support vet students with disability to access and participate in training and assessment on an equal basis. So that's the intent. What are we aiming for? And then underneath that, they'll have a list of performance indicators. As the name suggests, a list of things that will indicate to us and I guess to the regulator that we're meeting the intent of the outcome standard. So how do we do it? So I would say there's specific measures, how we're meeting the outcome standard, and a list of, you notice the wording they use is, they always start with the phrase, an RTO demonstrates. So it'll say something like, an RTO demonstrates, and then it'll have a list of things. For example, that students are supported to disclose their disability if the student wishes to do so. So they always use that term, an RTO demonstrates, which I think is pretty good. It makes it pretty clear what we need to do. And further, we'll talk about this in a moment, but we have the ASQA practice guides that add some additional commentary to that as well. And if you're wondering, this looks a little bit familiar, I think this reminds me of the interplay in a unit of competency between the performance evidence and the performance criteria. So I would say the performance evidence reminds me of the outcome standard, you know, the broad kind of description of what needs to happen. And then the performance criteria, which goes and describes the quality or the steps of that actually happening. So it's somewhat familiar in that sense, I think. So just on that wording, I think if you're a provider who's, you know, just going through these new requirements and you're trying to think, well, how do we comply? You know, what are we going to do? I like to visualize the auditor, and that's a lovely AI generated ASQA auditor there. It's not a real one, but I imagine I need to get out of the habit of calling them auditors and call them performance assessors. So imagine the ASQA performance assessor is there in the room with you, and you can use that wording and go, imagine them asking you, excuse me, sir or madam, how does your RTO demonstrate that ... And then you can just use the wording from those performance indicators, like, how does your RTO demonstrate that training reflects current industry practice? And you can actually ask yourself that question and try and answer that question. And if you can list off a few things, then that's the sort of thing that you might put forward if you're under regulatory scrutiny. How does your RTO demonstrate that queries from students are responded to in a timely manner? How does your RTO demonstrate that necessary skills and knowledge are able to be attained during work placements? So you can use that wording and kind of break it down and create yourself almost like a little questionnaire to answer. I've got a little activity for you. I'll put a link in the chat. There we go. So I've just put a link to it in the chat, but if you want to sort of do it manually, the link is asqua.gov.au/how-we-regelate/standards-RTOs/practice-guides, a bit of a mouthful. That's the direct link to access ASQA's practice guides. So if you can, you don't have to, I won't quiz you on it so much, but if you can, in a new tab or on your phone or whatever, try and access ASQA's new practice guides. And they're hot off the press. Like the one in the picture there actually has a date of the 17th of June. So not even, so literally last week that one was fully published. They've been sitting around in draft versions for a while. So I want you to go and find that page, and then here's a little activity for you. When you find that page, I want you to scroll down to Quality Area 1. So it looks like that little picture I've got there on the right, where it says Training and Assessment, under that sort of blue rectangle. And then click on the first bullet, which is Training. Then I want you to follow the links to download that practice guide, because they're not like the previous set of information they had. You've just got to download the PDF document and download it. And then I want you to have a look in there and go to where it says, it's just at the very top on I think the first or second page, standard 1.1, training is engaging, well structured, and so on. And then in the column on the right-hand side, there's a column that says example activities and considerations for compliance. And so I've got a little quiz for you. And I want to see if you can identify, what does it say you should provide students with sufficient opportunity to do? Yes, there we go. Okay, I think the the chat's going to get pretty wild now. Maybe I should have thought this through, but you'll get to see it about 300 times. Well done, thank you. Okay, you've got it. So I can see here that you all know how to access practice guides. Now, so this is this kind of thing where the old saying of give someone a fish and they'll eat for a day, and teach them to fish and you'll feed them for a lifetime kind of thing. I think these practice guides are pretty good, and I am fairly confident that the regulator is also using these practice guides to inform their regulatory staff on what to look for. And so you can quite clearly see those practice guides. They've been pretty well set out. They include just the same wording as the standards on the left-hand side, but then they give you some additional guidance on the right-hand side. And then they also go in, they talk about some of the risk factors that they might be looking for as well. So they're pretty good, and I would strongly recommend that when you're implementing new systems in your RTO to address these requirements, that you go in and have a look at those practice guides, because they're pretty good. They add some pretty good commentary, I would say. They've done a good job with that. And so yes, as you've all pointed out very well, the answer I was looking for is that we should provide students with sufficient opportunity to reflect on and absorb the knowledge, apply feedback, and practice their skills in different contexts and environments before they are assessed. I brought that up because I really feel like this is the first time that we're seeing these actual evidence-based, science-backed kind of training practices being referred to from the regulator. So previously it's kind of been like they say, well, we want quality training, but then it's up to the provider to sort of figure out, well, what is quality training? We're actually seeing here some I think, like as a training specialist myself, I look at this and I think, yes, that's good. That's good. We should be doing that. We should, regardless of what we teach, whether we're in heavy machinery, or we're in community services, or accounting or business services, or whatever, we probably should be providing students with sufficient opportunity to reflect on, absorb knowledge, apply feedback, and practice their skills before they're assessed. That's good training. And it's nice to see that in the practice guide. Hi, Shameen, nice to see you. Let's go to part 1, training and assessment. Quality area 1. So this is unfortunately where we're a bit wordy on the screen, but I've done my best to distill the wording a bit more. So standard 1.1 says that training is engaging, well-structured, and enables students to attain skills and knowledge consistent with the training product. And as mentioned, I'm not covering everything, but I've just honed in here on 1.1b, which is they've said that delivery modes must enable students to attain skills and knowledge consistent with the training product. By the way, they use this term training product throughout the new standards. and it was in the previous one as well, it's not a new term, but just to clarify, training product may refer to a single unit of competency, a group of units in a skill set, and a group of units in a qualification. All of those things, unit, skill set, qualification, as well as accredited course, they all are training products. There's something I'll bring up a little bit later when it comes to validation where I've got a bit of a question mark over what, what does that actually mean? How do we define training product? But we'll get to that. So I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but after each of these, I'll just put in some guiding questions. And and Kim, sorry, I just saw in the chat there, Kim, you've put in, thank you for that. It looks to me, I'm just looking at that URL and I missed the previous chat, but it looks like you're talking about the up and coming ASQA webinar. So that I would, if you want, you could leave this session now and just go to theirs, because get it from the horse's mouth is probably going to be way more informative than mine. But if you want to stick around and see my interpretation of it, then please do so. But I've put these little guiding questions down below. I'll be at that webinar too. I was booked in for one of the others and I really wanted to go to one of the more kind of focus sessions that they had. And I had a last minute thing that came up. It was a family obligation. I couldn't make it. So yes, I'll be in that one too, Kim, and I look forward to it very much. Okay, so I would probably just sum it up with that last question. Are we trying to deliver a unit called Conduct Excavator Operations all online? Probably teaching someone to drive an excavator online, all online, is probably not a good idea. Certainly you probably cover the knowledge parts of it, the pre-start checks and whatever else, but predominantly that's a practical unit. And while this has kind of been captured in the previous standards, it's the first time where they're really specifically stating that we have a requirement now, an expectation. We're going to be looking to check that your delivery mode is consistent with what you're actually teaching. So ask yourself, as we are our delivery modes appropriate given what the students have to learn how to do? Thank you, Fiona, that's lovely. Standard 1.1, just this is a continuation of the previous one. So there's a couple of more things to talk about there. There's a bit in this one. So again, we're still talking about training being engaging, well-structured, and enables students to attain skills and knowledge consistent with the training product. There's a requirement that training is structured and paced to support students to progress, providing sufficient time for instruction, practice, feedback, and assessment. So there's now this, I think, up until now, they've really just stayed within the realms of competency-based training and assessment. So the kind of traditional spirit of competency-based training and assessment is that we're going to really just focus on checking that students have the skills and knowledge, the competencies to actually do the job and how you certify that. So huge focus on assessment, but you can figure out how you train them and assess them and that's it. So now they're going to be looking at really more than ever how you structure your training, how you support your students with their progression. Do they have enough time to learn? And it's, this can be really challenging because we out of the box, we might design these courses based on certain cohorts that provide a certain amount of time. But sometimes if we're not checking who's coming into our courses properly, and that's a requirement we'll talk about later, we can end up with people who need more time. It's the pace. We've got that word pacing there, or paced. We need to make sure that the pacing is sufficient for them to actually get the skills and knowledge before they're assessed. And then part D is that the training techniques, so they're looking at training techniques specifically, activities and resources, engage students and support their understanding. So my kind of more plain English questions, guiding questions, or thought-provoking things attached to that we might ask ourselves when we're trying to comply is, are students progressing through our training? So, and if you can say yes to that, it's probably a good sign that you're on the right track. So are they actually getting through the necessary training and getting to the point where they're actually able to demonstrate their skills at the end? Are they being explicitly taught what they need to know to be successful in the assessment? Is guided practice being provided? So there is a clear difference, and we've talked about this in some of our science of learning sessions where, you know, for vet learners, just throwing them in the deep end and saying, okay, it's practice time, off you go and enjoy yourselves, is typically not appropriate, especially for novice learners. That we've got this whole concept, as we all know, when we learn our TAE, we learn about scaffolding, and we need to be providing really clear guided practice up front. And then as students develop the skills and knowledge, we gradually can reduce that. And if we do that properly up front, then by the time that independent practice starts to happen, then the students are so much more confidently able to engage in those sorts of activities. Are they getting feedback on their progress? Does our course realistically give students enough time to learn and to be assessed? And a question for you trainers, how do you lead and model best practice among your peers? Like in other sessions, we often find in these kind of, in these compliance-based sessions, that you especially in larger organizations, is you have the compliance people and the senior management that are making decisions and setting the policies and procedures. And then you have the trainers and assessors that are on the ground on a daily basis working with the students. And if there's not a good dialogue between those two groups, then that can be a bit of a breakdown, can lead to compliance issues. And so I always sort of talk about, for trainers who feel like they might lack a bit of empowerment, like, well, what can I do? You know, I'm just following the procedure. Well, maybe there are some things within your area of control where you can provide leadership and model best practices. You know, show your peers what the right way to do it is if you're showing leadership on that. And yes, I can see from the chat there's some people can relate to that. Standard 1.3 is that the assessment system is fit for purpose and consistent with the training product. So there's a lot of stuff in here that's kind of pretty stock standard, because the old standards had a fairly heavy focus on assessment, on the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. So I'm not going to go through that. There's been some minor wording changes. You can catch the recording of a previous session I did, which covered the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, and sort of tune into some of those nuances. But what I want to focus on here is that the requirement now that it's just kind of like a shift in focus now. So now they want that assessment tools get reviewed prior to use, which is good practice anyway. If anyone's ever had the experience of just going and rolling out an assessment tool before it's been reviewed on a bunch of students and just hoping that it works, it often leads to, probably not disaster, but or sometimes it could, but it can be really problematic, because we look at it through our author's eyes and an expert's eyes, and we think, oh, it's great, you know, the student's going to love it. And then the students start reading the questions and activities and they go, oh, this is really, really challenging. I don't know what's expected of me. So they want a review prior to use. When you create a new assessment tool, you need to review that. Maybe for any, I know there's at least one Top Gun RTO materials developer in our session today, but maybe you could mention in the chat about what might happen if you are purchasing assessment tools. There's probably an obligation to still review them even though you've purchased them, but perhaps, I know some assessment tool developers will actually provide evidence of a review that they've already done. I don't know if that's sufficient. So if your name starts with Shameen and ends with Simpson, perhaps you could comment on that. And then we've got the sort of follow on from that, which is that the outcome of the review informs any necessary changes to assessment tools. So some questions on that is, what's our review process? What does our, I've mixed the wording up there. What is our review process, and what is our tool that we use to record the outcomes of that review? How do we document that the review happened? Because you probably have to have some evidence on hand that this happened. Does our record or tools show what changes needed to be made? And how do we make sure that those changes actually happened? It would probably be problematic if you were to go in there and list a whole bunch of things that you need to change and then you actually didn't do it. So make sure you kind of have that evidence trail on hand. I think it would be a good idea. That's good, Rian. I'm glad Asqua liked it. Oh, there we go, Shamin. Thank you. An ERTO purchasing off-the-shelf tool must review and customize the tool before use, even if the off-the-shelf provider provides evidence of having reviewed and validated the tools. Amazing. Thank you. Standard 1.5 says the assessment system is quality assured through a regular process of validating assessment practices and judgments. Okay, so this is not new. We always had to do validation, but there's been some shifts. So you can see from my previous slide that they're looking at what we might have, or in the TAE, we call pre-assessment validation. They're calling a, pre-use review. And now they're actually very explicitly stating that validation needs to focus on practices and judgments. So it's not this kind of mechanical review of the wording of the assessment tools or the structure. You're just looking at the way it's actually being used by assessors. Okay, thanks for that also, Naomi. You've said that that Asqua said if you were using new materials, then you were to conduct a validation prior to use. And they stated it was not called pre-delivery. Okay. Excuse me. So the focus of what they are specifically referring to here as validation, they're saying needs to really focus on practices and judgments. Now, for any of you who've actually been through a validation process, you might have had this experience that at least my experience is, I find validating practices and judgments is very revealing. And I think it's probably like, if you're worried about things like the wording of the tool and the alignment with LLN, these, does it, you often see in validation, these questions like, are the assessment instructions there, and do they show the reliability of the assessment and that kind of thing? And you're worried that if we just focus on practices and judgments, we might lose that. Looking at validating practices and judgment is super revealing. It shows all that stuff. You don't have to worry about it. You will soon reveal, if you're doing a genuine and honest validation of your practices and judgments, how your assessors are actually interpreting the assessment tools and administering them, how your students are understanding the requirements for their assessments, and what sort of work they're turning in, and what decision the assessor made about that work. That is super revealing about all the other things. So I think it's really great that we're honing in on practices and judgments. There used to be this kind of, 5 years and 3 years, and if this, then that kind of stuff. But now they're just being really clear and saying every training product on scope is validated once every 5 years. But they're also adding that you should do it more if it's particularly risky, or there's been changes, or there's feedback from industry or students or others that might indicate that you need to review and revalidate the whole thing. So some guiding questions here. What's our program for validation to ensure it all gets done in this time frame? I love the idea, at least in our RTO, what we do is we have a program. It's like because I don't want to just wait until 5 years and then go, right, let's do all of our validation in one hit. Why not just do one unit at a time? One unit every 3 months. Get someone in to come and help out, do the validation. What does that tell us? And that way we've got this sort of roll-on effect. How do we determine risk? So for some of us, there's going to be risk factors that determine we need to do it more often. I would say TAE, which was what we spend most of our time in, that's pretty high risk. It might not seem like it at first, but think about what's happening when someone gets a TAE certificate 4 from Excelia. We need to be satisfied that they're there, because they might be going out and training and assessing high risk, high voltage, chemicals, working with vulnerable people. So we need to be satisfied that what we're doing is compliant. And so I want to see our validation done more than 5 years. That's an increase of risk factor. I'm loving all the sharing of knowledge and that's happening in the in the chat here. I think a lot of you probably have LinkedIn. You can all hook up with each other and share ideas. I think that's great. Kel, you've said that was something I flagged earlier. All training products on scope are implicit units within qualifications included, and I actually don't know the answer to that question. I know in one of my expert groups that I'm involved in, where we have a few other TA providers that all kind of share ideas, that question got raised and we didn't quite know the answer to that. So yeah, I would err on the side of caution and say, if you're delivering a unit that's part of a qualification, you should definitely validate it. If there's an implicit unit that's not being delivered and assessed at all, I would question why that needs to be validated. But again, I don't know if that's the correct answer, because it is saying every training product on scope. And if we take that really, really literally, that means every unit. So maybe that's something that I'll learn in my ASCL webinar this Friday. If you know the answer, put it in the chat. Thank you. So what's our program for validation? Definitely have a program, I think is really good, rather than just kind of having a policy and then hoping that it gets done and then panicking at the last minute because it wasn't done. Also ask yourself how you determine the risk. I think you'll probably need to demonstrate that, like a good old, the old risk matrix we learn in WHS. Like what's the likelihood that something really bad is going to happen if we don't train our students properly? What's the consequences of them being, assessed poorly? And so if you can pretty easily kind of even mentally do that exercise and go, we're teaching arts and crafts at the community college, pretty low risk. You'd probably stick with your 5 years. But if you're doing high voltage or something, then I think that's an increased risk. How do we ensure validation is triggered? So we've got this extra requirement there in B. There's that thing that says, you need to do it more if there's changes or feedback. So have a think about your systems, like when that external information comes in, if there's a complaint or if there's an incident that one of your graduates has been involved in that you get wind of, how can that information be fed back in and actually trigger a validation? So have a think about your processes for that. Standard 1.8 is facilities, resources and equipment for each training product are fit for purpose, safe and accessible and sufficient. And the things that I wanted to focus on here is part BI, which is how the RTO ensures facilities, resources and equipment are and will continue to be suitable and safe for use by students. This has always been kind of implied in previous standards, but it's now really explicit that they want to look at the facilities, the resources and equipment and make sure that they're suitable. They reflect the industry, that they're safe for use. And then there's C, which is that we need to have documented strategies and procedures for managing risk associated with students using facilities, resources and equipment when they're going outside to work placements and so on. Some questions for you. Do our facilities, resources and equipment reflect real world practice? Are they safe? How do we make sure it's safe? How do we make sure it stays safe on an ongoing basis? How do we ensure students that we send out there into the big wide world are kept safe on the job as well? Part 2, vet student support. So this is a new, vet student support's not new, but some of the requirements here are new. So let's have a look at it. So we have this thing, there's always been a thing where they've said, you've got to advise students before enrollment so they know what they're getting themselves in for. They've really doubled down on that. So they're now saying that we need to have procedures in place to review prior to enrollment. I've got that in bold there. So they're really clear on that, prior to enrollment, the skills and competencies of prospective students. And we have to check their language, literacy, and numeracy proficiency and digital literacy. And then based on that, we need to provide advice to each prospective student about whether the training is suitable. So that's going to vary depending on what you offer. I'll give you an example. Numeracy in the TAE course is not a huge thing. It sort of pops up here and there as a foundation skill requirement, but it's nothing compared to, say, the communication skills, the high level of communication skills needed by a trainer. So we're not really focusing much on numeracy, but we're really interested in the language and literacy skills of our students before they enroll in a TAE. And digital literacy is important as well. So questions for you: how do we know before they enroll that students have the necessary skills and competencies to have a chance of success in our course? How do we know if their L, L, N, and D, that's digital skills, are sufficient with the support that we can offer? And how can we prove that we've reviewed these skills and gave advice to any enrolled student? So I suppose at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to kind of, stop someone from enrolling. But you probably need to, at the very least, demonstrate that you've made the efforts to assess their skill and say, hey, maybe consider whether this is suitable for you. Darren asks, do we need to purchase a program such as the LLN robot? There's no requirement that you have to go and purchase a program. It might be a really simple way to get up and running, or maybe it's a way of addressing the requirements in the short term while you meet the requirements yourself. Maybe you use a Word document or a printed test. It doesn't have to be that. So the LLN robot's a digital tool that's available. Have a look up. You can Google it. There's other providers as well. Same with digital literacy. So a thing, I'll probably spend like 1 minute on this because I'm running out of time again. I want you to reflect on what are the language literacy and or numeracy skills necessary for the course you teach. What are the digital skills that they need to be successful in the training? And then if you'd like to just quickly add in the chat, how might your RTO review these skills prior to enrolment? Brief reflection, a couple of comments. I'd love to see what you're doing. Okay, so some people are using the LLN robot. Some people have a quiz. Some people just have a chat. And because we're a really low volume, like we don't pump through hundreds of students, we're actually able to have a conversation. There's a new emphasis on support services. So we must determine the support services to be provided to each student and make it available. We need to have access to trainers and assessors and others who are responsible for supporting them. We need to inform students about how and when they can access trainers and assessors and others. And we need to make sure there's actually an explicit requirement there that student queries are responded to in a timely manner. There's not really a definition on what timely manner means, but I think they'll probably look at it in the context of the training that you offer. There's some questions there for you to consider. One big one is, so we're all answering the question of how do we know what support they need, but more of the case, how do we reduce the chances of finding ourselves in a situation where we don't have the people or expertise to support our students? So that's why that upfront kind of advice to students before they enroll is so important, setting those expectations. There's a big thing on really promoting, like it's not just about this tokenistic thing of like, here's the support we offer, it's in the student handbook and see you later, but what are we doing to actively promote this support that's available? When you're looking at responding to student queries in a timely manner, you might consider having a service charter or a service commitment and reviewing on a regular basis whether or not you're sticking to it. Oh, thanks, Naomi. I said what Asker said. That's good. Reasonable adjustments are made to support students with disability. So this is something that someone amazing like Darlene McLennan, who is, you might recall, did a really great session with us last year. She was the manager, I think she's no longer in that role, but she was the manager for ADSET, who do really great disability advocacy in tertiary education. So check out the recording. ADSET have amazing professional development on this stuff that's free, great resources for reasonable adjustments. So check that out. This is a new requirement. We must promote and support the diversity of VET students and specifically foster a safe and inclusive learning environment and foster a culturally safe learning environment for First Nations people. So I would ask questions of myself or my team, my colleagues, what PD can I undertake to help me create a more safe and inclusive environment? How am I fostering this culture among my peers? How can I connect with Aboriginal people in my local community and bring their voices into my teaching? I can't quite announce it yet, but we have a very, very on-topic session coming up in August that will be really relevant for this stuff. I've been trying to brew it up for so long and I can't wait to bring it to you. Standard 2.6 is that stuff on well-being. Now, that was I found this one really interesting and really important, and it's so great to see it pop up in the standards. We did a whole session on it with Dr. Robbie Lloyd a couple of sessions ago, and the recording of that's up on our website as well, so definitely check that out. I think that covers it really, really well. I don't need to go into it now. One thing that, I mean, we've always had the thing for complaints and appeals, but they've added in there operating an appeals management system that provides avenue for review by an independent party if requested by the appellant at no or low cost to the appellant. To be honest, we haven't actually looked at how we'll do that. But the main reason we're just taking, because we're a small team, we haven't got resources to do everything immediately. We actually haven't had an assessment appeal. I can't even remember the last time we had one, or an appeal on any other decision. So I've kind of delegated that to a lower priority, and I haven't answered the question, I'm being really honest here, about who our independent third party will be. But we have to have one. And there's, as far as I can tell, there's no kind of, RTO ombudsman that will provide that service specifically. There will be in relation to, consumer, fair trading and that kind of stuff, of course. I think the big one here is, as of next week, if you still hold the TAE 40110, yes, you can train and assess without upgrading. That's kind of the big one here. I'm on the tail end of a bit of a cold and I'm almost losing my voice, which is probably good because we're getting up to an hour. So this one is about the credential policy. So the credential policy is really clear. It's really nice and sets it out really well of very specifically what the requirements are. There's a big emphasis on professional development. Once again, big kudos to all of you because you're here, you're committed to your professional development, and that's amazing. So keep doing that. We're not the only provider of PD. So there's lots of ways you can get involved and increase your skills and knowledge, and keep doing that. There's some, I'll just quickly tune you into this, there's some requirements on engaging experts. So they've made some specific treatments on when you bring someone from outside who maybe doesn't have their Cert 4 in training and assessment, like a guest lecturer. You just need to have a really good reason for doing that, being able to really justify it. And I think having experts, guest speakers in courses is amazing. I love it. You know, sometimes we bring in expert speakers to talk to our students, or we bring them somewhere, and you know, it might only be an hour talk. So having someone have to go and do a TAE because they're going to talk to your students for an hour is a bit ridiculous. So you just want to have a good reason for them to do that and sort of set up that appropriate supervision. So there's lots of guidance there. And of course, the ASQA practice guide, you know, it adds a lot of commentary on that as well. Quickly, some notable points on governance, and then we'll wrap it up. Standard 4.1 says that its governing persons lead a culture of integrity, fairness, and transparency in the organisation's delivery of services. I love that that's specifically mentioned in there for the governing persons. That's so important. The RTO leadership needs to support staff members to understand the components of the standards. If you're here, you're doing that, which is great. They've got to inform staff of any changes to regulatory requirements, and the roles and responsibilities of people engaged are well understood and documented. Pardon me. All right, so our recap is we looked at the structure. There's 3 parts: outcome standards, compliance requirements, and a credential policy. Our focus was on part A. We looked at the practice guides, really great additional source of information and commentary straight from ASQA. And then finally, we looked at the key notable differences in the new standards, especially in the outcome standards part. We had a quick look at standard 4. All right, thanks for sticking with me. I went 1 minute over time. Apologies. I really appreciate you sharing your time. Once again, if you stuck around for most of the session, we will send you out a certificate, typically within 1 week, hopefully not that long. If it doesn't come through for whatever reason, feel free to reach out and let us know. The recording will go up. We'll put it out in the newsletter. It'll go up on our website, along with the slides and any other resources we mentioned. So once again, thank you so much for being part of our community. I just really love all of you and how you are so enthusiastic about this, and it means a great deal. Have a really great day, and good luck with all your compliance stuff with these new standards. Let's share our knowledge, experience, and solutions. All the best.